My name is Deacon Mercier. For 12 years, I tracked predators across the Louisiana bayou as a wildlife specialist. Now, I track the dead. When the zombie outbreak hit, my sanctuary became a hunting ground. I survived the first month alone in the swamps while cities fell and the military retreated. This is how I adapted when the rules of nature were rewritten overnight. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Before all this, I tracked gators, managed invasive species, and monitored ecosystem health across the bayou for the state. Turns out those skills transfer pretty well to surviving the dead. My job with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries kept me in the wetlands year-round. I mapped territories, controlled predator populations, removed invasive species that threatened the ecosystem balance. I was the guy they called when something was killing livestock, when pythons were spotted where they shouldn't be, or when gator territories needed managing. The animals knew something was wrong before we did. That's what I keep coming back to. About 6 weeks before the first official reports, I noticed strange migration patterns. Deer moving at the wrong time of year, gator populations abandoning, prime territories with abundant food sources. Even the bird patterns shifted. At first I documented it all, filed the reports. My supervisors called it statistical anomalies and temporary disruptions due to weather patterns. But I'd been working these swamps my entire adult life. Something was off. I remember the specific day when my concerns peaked. It was a Tuesday in early September. I was checking fish populations in the eastern watershed when I found an entire section of bayou empty of life. Not just fewer fish than expected, complete absence. Water chemistry was normal. No obvious pollution. Just nothing living. I took samples anyway, filed another report. It was marked low priority and shelved. 3 days later, the first news reports began trickling in. An unusual illness in coastal communities. Isolated incidents of extreme aggression and fever. The CDC was investigating but assured everyone it was contained. The official line was, no need for public concern. Meanwhile, vultures and other scavengers were avoiding certain areas entirely. In my 15 years on the job, I'd never seen carrion birds refuse to feed on available carcasses. Nature was sending warnings that nobody in authority wanted to hear. They called it a public health situation on the news. I called my sister in Baton Rouge, told her to stock up on supplies. She laughed it off. Most people did. We've had health scares before that amounted to nothing. But I kept watching the animals and they kept retreating from the southeastern parishes. By late September, there were more official reports. Hospitals in smaller coastal towns were experiencing high volumes. The news started using words like quarantine and isolation protocols. Social media showed more than officials were admitting. Videos of violent patients, medical staff with bite wounds. The usual conspiracy theories started, but mixed in were genuine first-hand accounts that matched what I was seeing in wildlife behavior. Something serious was happening. I've always kept my cabin well stocked. Living in hurricane country teaches you preparedness. But I made extra supply runs then, added more shelf-stable food, medication, ammunition. My neighbors thought I was overreacting. Larry from down the bayou joked that I'd finally gone full prepper. He's not laughing anymore. No one is. Hurricane Elena hit the first week of October. Category 2, nothing coastal Louisiana hadn't weathered dozens of times. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The evacuation centers were already dealing with quarantine cases. Flooding was moderate to severe in the low-lying parishes, and something about the rising waters seemed to accelerate whatever was happening. I stayed at my elevated cabin rather than evacuate. Most locals did the same. Elena made landfall overnight, and by morning the winds had died down but the water was still rising. I took my boat out to check on immediate neighbors and assess wildlife impact. That's when I found Old Pete. Pete Thompson had been fishing these waters for 60 years. His cabin was about 2 miles downstream from mine. When I approached, I saw him standing in thigh-deep water near his dock. I called out, but he didn't respond. Just kept staring down into the water. I figured he was in shock, maybe injured during the storm. I brought my boat closer, and that's when he turned. His eyes were clouded over, milky white. His skin had a gray cast, despite his usual deep tan. Most disturbing was the wound on his neck, clearly a human bite mark, black with infection. When he saw me, he didn't call out or wave. He lunged, nearly capsized my boat, trying to grab me. I pushed off with the paddle and retreated, watching as he waded deeper, still coming after me until the water reached his chest. I reported it to emergency services immediately, but they were overwhelmed with the hurricane response. They logged my call and said someone would check when resources permitted. No one ever did. That night, I saw the first emergency broadcast about the contagious disease outbreak and advice to avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. Things deteriorated rapidly after that. Cell service became spotty within days. Power went out across most of the parish. I had my generator and solar set up so I could still catch radio broadcasts. The news grew worse each day. The infection was spreading faster than containment efforts. Major cities were establishing safe zones. The rural areas, like mine, were essentially on their own. By day 5 after the hurricane, most of the small fishing camps and isolated homes were either abandoned or overrun. I observed several more infected individuals from a safe distance. They all showed the same characteristics: mindless aggression, attraction to sound, complete disregard for self-preservation. They would wade into water pursuing potential prey until they were completely submerged. That's when I started seeing the military helicopters, not heading toward the affected communities but away. North, always north. No airdrops of supplies. No rescue operations for stranded civilians. Just occasional helicopter passes, observing and retreating. Whatever was happening, the government response was not about saving everyone. They were triaging the entire Gulf Coast. I made my decision then. While most survivors were fleeing toward Baton Rouge or New Orleans, toward the promised safe zones, I went deeper into the bayou. I've spent my life studying predator patterns and behavior. When danger comes, you don't go where the food is concentrated. You go where predators can't easily follow. The infected were showing distinct predator behavior patterns, and those patterns told me cities would become death traps no matter what authorities promised. Taking only what I could carry in my boat, I left my cabin on day 7. Essential: supplies, weapons, communication equipment, navigation tools, and my field notes. Already I had begun documenting the infected behavior, treating them like a new invasive species, learning their patterns to predict their movements. Knowledge meant survival now. The first week away from my cabin was the hardest adjustment. I established a temporary camp in an elevated hunting blind about 10 miles deep into the Atchafalaya Basin. The structure sat 12 feet above the water level, accessible only by a removable ladder. From there, I could observe a wide area of the bayou without being detected. I set up systems for water collection and purification using techniques we employed during extended field research. Created perimeter alarms with fishing line and empty cans. Basic security measures that would allow me to sleep without constant vigilance. Then I began my observation routine. Each day I documented infected movement in the surrounding area. Their numbers were still relatively low this deep in the basin, but that was changing as more people fled into previously uninhabited areas. The infected followed. I quickly confirmed they responded primarily to sound. Movement attracted them second. Their sense of smell seemed diminished except for fresh blood, which would send them into a frenzy. I noticed they struggled with certain terrain features. Deep mud slowed them considerably. They would follow flowing water downstream but rarely fought against current. They were most active at dawn and dusk, just like natural predators. Bright sunlight seemed to disorient them slightly. Heavy rain confused them entirely. I documented everything, partly to keep my scientific mind engaged, partly because information was the most valuable resource in this new world. On day 10, I encountered Martinez and his son. I'd gone fishing with them dozens of times before everything collapsed. They came stumbling through the marsh together, moving with the distinctive gait I now recognized immediately. Martinez's right arm was missing below the elbow. His son's throat had been torn open. Neither recognized me as they shambled past my observation post. They didn't recognize anything. They were just empty shells operating on basic predatory instinct. That night I faced the hardest truth of this new reality. These weren't people anymore. Not really. Just predators wearing familiar faces. The infection had stripped away everything. That made them human, leaving only hunger and aggression. Understanding this was crucial to survival, but it came with a psychological weight I wasn't prepared for. The weather turned on day 12. Heavy storms kept me confined to my blind for nearly 3 days. My supplies began running low. I couldn't risk movement in. The open during daylight and nighttime excursions had proven extremely dangerous. The infected might be slower and clumsier than the living, but they didn't need rest. They didn't feel fear. They didn't retreat from threats. Their only drive was to feed. When the storm finally broke, I made a cautious supply run to an abandoned fishing camp I'd marked on my map. That's when I noticed the first sign that the situation was evolving. The infected I observed now were moving differently in the water. The ones that had been in the bayou longest were more efficient, almost as if they were adapting to the aquatic environment. They weren't swimming exactly, but they'd learned to use the water's buoyancy to move with less energy expenditure. Evolution happens fast when survival is on the line. This principle applies to any species, and whatever these things were now, they were subject to the same natural laws. The thought that they could adapt, could evolve new behaviors, kept me awake that night despite my exhaustion. By the beginning of week 3, I'd established a routine: morning and evening observation sessions, midday for security maintenance and careful foraging, nights for rest and planning. I began mapping safe travel corridors through the basin, marking areas with higher infected concentration to avoid. The scientific approach kept me focused, kept the isolation from consuming my mind. That's when I saw them. The first living people I'd encountered in nearly 2 weeks. A family of 4 in a small aluminum boat with an outboard motor that was clearly running on fumes. City folks, judging by their clothes and equipment, totally unprepared for bayou survival. The 2 kids looked half-starved. The parents weren't much better. I could have stayed hidden. Should have, maybe. But something about seeing other living, thinking humans broke through the protective shell I'd built around myself. I signaled them with a small mirror flash, directed them to a secure docking area near my blind. Their story confirmed my worst fears about the larger situation. They'd fled New Orleans after the hospital system collapsed. The military had established a secure zone initially, then abandoned it without warning when the infection breached the perimeter. The father, Michael, had been a history teacher. His wife, Lisa, was a nurse who'd seen firsthand how quickly the infection spread. Their children, a boy and girl around 10 and 12, were thin and quiet, shock visible in their eyes. I shared what food I could spare, helped them repair their motor, and gave them a map marked with potentially safer routes west. They were trying to reach family in Texas, convinced that moving inland away from the coastal outbreak would lead to safety. I tried to explain what I'd observed about infected migration patterns, about how they followed human movement. I warned them about traveling at night. They thanked me but didn't heed the warning. Their gas was running low. They were desperate to reach somewhere they thought represented safety. I offered to escort them to a more secure location I knew of, at least until morning, but fear and desperation make people irrational. They left as sunset approached, promising to be careful. I heard their screams 3 hours later, carried across the water in the still night air. Too distant for me to help, even if I could have reached them in time. The motor had gone silent. The screaming eventually stopped. I marked another area on my map to avoid. That night taught me another crucial lesson. The infected weren't the only danger in this new world. Desperation, fear, and ignorance were just as deadly. I'd offered what help I could, shared knowledge that might have saved them, but they made their choice. In this new reality, I couldn't save everyone. I could barely ensure my own survival. The weight of that truth settled onto me like a physical burden. As the 3rd week progressed, I began noticing signs of other human activity in my territory. Not just desperate refugees passing through, but people who seemed to be operating with purpose. Smoke from campfires in areas I knew were defensible, trap lines I hadn't set. Once, distant gunshots followed by silence. I became more cautious in my movements. Started watching for human signs as carefully as I tracked the infected. Then I found the camp, a small family settlement that had been established on a dry patch of ground near the basin's northwestern edge. 4 bodies, executed with gunshots to the head. Their supplies completely looted. No signs of infected activity. This was human predation, cold and calculated. The living were becoming more dangerous than the dead in some ways. At least the infected were predictable, driven by simple needs and impulses. Humans were complex, unpredictable, capable of both compassion and cruelty. I adapted my security measures accordingly, disguising my presence from human detection as carefully as from the infected. As I continued to document the changing patterns around me, I noticed something that truly concerned me. The infected were not just growing in number as more people succumbed to the outbreak. They were beginning to exhibit coordinated movement. Not communication or cooperation exactly, but something more like herd behavior. When one detected potential prey, others in the vicinity would respond to the first one's increased activity rather than to the prey itself. It was subtle, but to someone who had studied predator patterns for years, it was unmistakable. By the beginning of week 4, I knew my position at the hunting blind was becoming untenable. The density of infected in the area was increasing daily, and I'd spotted another group of armed survivors moving methodically through the region, clearing structures and collecting supplies. Whether they were dangerous or simply pragmatic wasn't something I could afford to find out. It was time to move again. I had prepared for this possibility. Before the outbreak, I maintained a small cabin further north near the upper reaches of the Atchafalaya Basin. It was my hurricane retreat, a place I'd stocked with long-term supplies and equipped for extended isolation. Getting there meant traveling nearly 15 miles through increasingly dangerous territory, but staying in place was no longer an option. I spent 2 days preparing for the journey, gathered what supplies I could carry, created lightweight defensive tools that wouldn't slow my movement, developed camouflage techniques to mask my human scent and appearance from both infected and living predators. The mud and plant mixture I created had worked well during observation runs. The dead relied increasingly on smell as they aged, I had noticed. Their other senses seemed to dull over time, but their ability to track by scent actually improved. On the morning of day 24, I set out. The first leg took me through familiar territory, areas I had scouted thoroughly and marked on my hand-drawn maps. I navigated using natural landmarks, avoiding the more obvious waterways that others might follow. The infected tended to concentrate along the main bayou channels, drawn by the occasional passing boats of other survivors. I stuck to the shallow backwaters, poling my small pirogue silently through the cypress groves. By midday, I reached what had once been a reliable rest point, an elevated platform other wildlife officers and I had used during extended surveys. It had been overrun. 3 infected were tangled in the wooden structure, their bloated bodies wedged between support beams. They noticed me immediately, their clouded eyes tracking my movement with unnerving focus. I altered course without hesitation. Engaging unless absolutely necessary wastes energy and creates noise that attracts more of them. That afternoon brought my first sighting of what I would later call a herd. Not dozens, but hundreds of infected, moving together through the flooded lowlands like a slow-flowing river of bodies. They were headed north, the same direction I needed to go. Something was drawing them. Whether it was a large group of survivors or something else, I couldn't tell, but their movement was purposeful, directed, unlike the random wandering I'd observed in smaller groups. I was forced to change my route, adding miles to my journey but providing a safer path. This took me closer to inhabited areas than I preferred. The abandoned outskirts of Bayou Sorrel loomed to my west as evening approached. I needed shelter for the night, somewhere defensible but temporary. The elevated water tower seemed my best option, accessible by a single ladder I could pull up behind me. The climb was tense, exposed. Any watcher, living or dead, would have spotted me easily, but I reached the maintenance platform without incident and secured my position. From this, height I could see for miles across the basin. The herd I'd spotted earlier was clearly visible, a dark mass flowing between the trees. Their trajectory would take them straight through my planned route. I would need yet another detour, this time through the residential areas I'd hoped to avoid. I spent that night planning, using the last light to mark alternate paths on my map. The weather was changing again, low-pressure system moving in from the Gulf. The coming rain would provide good cover for movement but would make navigation more challenging. I could use the storm, if I timed it right. I broke camp before dawn, knowing I needed to clear the populated areas before full light exposed me to any watchers. The first houses appeared as gray shadows in the gloom. Single-story structures built on low stilts, many of them partially submerged by the persistent flooding. Perfect breeding grounds for the infected, trapped in flooded rooms but still deadly, if you came within reach. I moved house to house, scavenging what I could. Most had been picked clean already, but I found medication in a bathroom cabinet that had been overlooked, and ammunition in a child's toy chest that someone hadn't thought to check. Small victories, each one increasing my chances of survival. Midway through the abandoned neighborhood, I encountered something that stopped me cold. An infected that wasn't just wandering aimlessly. It was moving with purpose, checking inside vehicles, testing doors on houses. It paused periodically, as if listening or smelling the air. When it turned toward a sound I couldn't hear, I saw that half its face had been torn away, exposing teeth and jawbone. Yet it moved with more coordination than any infected I'd encountered before. I froze, waiting to see what it would do. It continued its methodical search pattern, working its way down the street toward my position. I retreated silently into the nearest house, finding the highest ground in case it entered. The attic access was still above water level. I pulled myself up and closed the hatch just as the door below creaked open. The infected entered, moving from room to room with terrible purpose. It paused directly beneath my position. I held my breath, though I knew it couldn't hear something so subtle. It was sensing something else. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, it moved on. I remained hidden until nightfall, processing what I'd seen. The virus was creating specialists, hunters. The thought kept me awake through the night, watching through a small attic vent for any sign of its return. The storm hit before dawn, earlier than forecast. Rain hammered the roof above me. Wind rocked the partially flooded house on its foundations. But as I'd learned over years in the bayou, such conditions create opportunity if you know how to use them. Rain masks sound and scent. Wind creates constant background noise that helps disguise movement. The rising water would slow the infected, in the residential areas where they had to navigate more obstacles. I slipped out into the deluge, navigating like the migratory birds do in poor conditions, following subtle water currents that indicated higher ground, identifying cypress stands that only grow in certain elevations. Progress was slow but steady. By mid-morning, I had cleared the residential area and reached the northern wetlands that would lead to my secondary cabin. The journey through the storm was both blessing and curse. While it provided excellent cover, the conditions were treacherous. Twice I nearly capsized in sudden current surges. Once I had to detour a mile east when a fallen cypress blocked my path. But I pushed on, knowing that my destination offered security that would be worth the struggle. As evening approached on the second day of travel, I finally spotted the familiar landmark that signaled I was close. 3 cypress trees grown together at the base, forming what looked like a single massive trunk that split into 320 feet up. From there, it was less than a mile to my cabin. I approached cautiously. The area seemed untouched by human activity. No signs of the infected or other survivors, but appearances could be deceiving in this new world. I secured my boat a quarter mile from the cabin and proceeded on foot, moving from cover to cover, stopping frequently to listen and observe. When the cabin finally came into view, it appeared untouched. Too untouched. In the 3 weeks since the outbreak began, nothing had disturbed the spiderwebs on the porch or the leaf litter around the foundation. Someone had been careful to leave no trace of their presence. I spent an hour watching from concealment before approaching. No movement, no sound except wildlife and rain. When I finally entered, my suspicions were confirmed. Someone had been there recently. They had taken some supplies but left the structure intact. More concerning was what I found on the roof during my initial security check. Looking south through my field glasses, I could see the slow movement of the herd I'd spotted 2 days earlier. They were still coming north, following me or following something in the same direction. I had perhaps 2 days before they reached this area. I used every minute. First priority was reinforcing the cabin's vulnerabilities, boarding windows, securing doors, creating noise distractions that could be triggered remotely to draw attention away from my position if needed. Next came establishing multiple escape routes. In wildlife management, we often create elevated corridors for certain species to bypass dangerous areas. I built something similar for myself, rope bridges between trees that the dead couldn't reach. I set up my observation post on the cabin roof, concealed under a blind of local vegetation. From there I could monitor a wide radius around my position. The first infected arrived sooner than I expected. Advanced scouts, moving faster than the main herd. They passed nearby without detecting me, but their presence confirmed my fears. The main group would be here by morning. They came like a flood at dawn. Hundreds, maybe 1,000. And they were not just passing through as I had hoped. They surrounded the area, moving in expanding circles from a central point about half a mile from my cabin. Almost like they knew something was here. That is when I noticed they were being directed somehow by more aggressive infected at the edges of the herd, the same type of hunter I had seen in the residential area, now working in concert with the main group. By the third day of what I now thought of as the siege, I knew waiting was not an option. The herd showed no signs of dispersing naturally, as they should have based on my previous observations of infected behavior. Something was keeping them organized, concentrated in this area. I needed to break that pattern or die in that cabin as supplies dwindled. I spent that night formulating a plan based on wildlife management principles. In conservation work, we sometimes use controlled burns to direct animal movement. Fire is a primal force that everything, living or dead, responds to. The recent rain had dampened the understory, but not enough to prevent a controlled burn from taking hold. I created a horseshoe pattern of small fire starter piles, positioned to exploit the prevailing wind direction and natural fire breaks. If ignited in sequence, they would create a corridor of flames that would leave only one path open for the herd, away from my position. The execution would be high risk. Moving outside the cabin meant potential detection. Setting the fires meant creating noise and visible activity, but I had no choice. On the morning of the fourth day, I gathered my essential supplies in a waterproof pack, prepared my escape route through the drainage culvert that ran beneath the access road, and waited for optimal conditions. The wind shifted favorably around midday. I moved quickly from point to point, setting my fire starters and retreating before they fully ignited. The first flames caught slowly, then accelerated as they found drier fuel. Smoke billowed upward, visible for miles. The reaction from the herd was immediate and dramatic. The infected retreated from the flames instinctively, crowding away from the heat and smoke. The hunters tried to maintain the perimeter, but even they responded to the primal threat of fire. As the flames spread along my planned horseshoe, the herd began moving east, away from both the fire and my position. I waited until their attention was fully diverted, then slipped into the drainage culvert, wading through chest-deep water for nearly half a mile before emerging into a different landscape. The controlled burn had become something larger, driven by the wind and available fuel. Smoke obscured much of the sky. The infected were now fully committed to their eastward movement, a river of bodies flowing away from the threat. After swimming through the drainage system, I came up nearly a mile away from my cabin. That is when I saw it, through a break in the smoke and trees. A military installation on the north ridge. Lights still running, active helicopters moving, in and out. They were using sound and light to draw the dead away from whatever they were protecting. My cabin had been caught between their attraction point and the approaching herd. The convergence had nearly cost me my life. I circled wide around the military perimeter, noting their security measures and activity patterns. Whatever they were doing, they had significant resources, power, vehicles, armed personnel. They were not evacuating as I had seen other military units doing. They were operating with purpose. This was not a rescue operation or evacuation point. This was something else entirely. I returned to my partially burned but still viable cabin after confirming the herd had moved well clear of the area. The fire had created a natural barrier that would deter their return for some time. Inside, I began processing what I had learned. The infected were being manipulated, herded by both their own evolved behaviors and external forces. The military installation was clearly using them for some purpose or studying them. Either way, it represented a major factor in understanding the regional dynamics of this new reality. That night, I began mapping on a larger scale, not just my immediate territory, but the entire basin, marking herd movements, safe corridors, danger zones. I suspected others like me were doing the same in their own areas. Specialists who had survived because of their specific knowledge, now using that expertise to navigate this transformed world. I retrieved the emergency radio equipment I had stored at the cabin before the outbreak. Most frequencies were silent or filled with automated emergency broadcasts. But on the old wildlife management channels, I found something unexpected. Voices. Other specialists communicating in the technical shorthand of our profession. Biologists, park rangers, wildlife officers sharing information about infected movement patterns, safe zones, resources. I made contact, identifying myself by my old department call sign. The response was immediate. Others had survived across the region, using their knowledge of the natural world to avoid the worst of the outbreak. We began exchanging crucial survival information, coordinating observations, building a network of isolated specialists who together might understand the broader patterns emerging. That is when I realized my training might be worth more than just keeping me alive. The patterns, the migrations. This was ecological management on a whole new scale. The infected were becoming part of the ecosystem, following rules and patterns that could be predicted, perhaps even manipulated as I had done with the fire. Understanding those patterns might be the key to long-term survival, not just for me but for any human enclaves that remained. As I expanded my observation areas over the following days, I noticed something troubling. Animals were avoiding certain areas where there were no obvious infected present. Bird flight patterns diverted around seemingly empty stretches of bayou. Alligators abandoned territories they had held for years. The natural world was sensing something that I could not yet see. Then, 7 days after the siege and fire, I glimpsed movement on the eastern perimeter of my new territory. Not the shambling gait of standard infected. Not the purposeful search pattern of the hunters. This was something else. Faster. More coordinated. A flash of movement between trees that vanished before I could focus my field glasses properly. I have been watching the eastern swamps carefully since then, documenting the strange patterns, setting observation blinds to capture more detail. What I have seen keeps me awake at night. The infection is evolving, adapting, creating new variants with new capabilities. And that is what truly terrifies me. Not what the infection has done to us already, but what it is still becoming. I continued monitoring the eastern boundary of my territory for several days, trying to confirm what I'd glimpsed. The new type of infected remained elusive, appearing only in brief moments before disappearing into the underbrush. What I could see concerned me deeply. Unlike the standard infected with their awkward, shambling movements, these moved with fluidity. They stayed low to the ground when traveling. They paused to assess their surroundings. Most concerning of all, they seemed to actively avoid my observation points, as if they could sense the presence of watching eyes. After a week of limited sightings, I made the difficult decision to venture closer to their territory for better observation. I established a blind in a cypress tree overlooking a clearing where I'd noted multiple crossings. The setup took most of a day, carefully constructed to blend with the natural canopy. I stocked it with 3 days of supplies, determined to remain in place until I had documented solid evidence of what we were facing. On the second day, just before dusk, I got my confirmation. 3 infected moved into the clearing together, Their skin had the same grayish pallor as the others, but their bodies weren't showing the same level of decomposition, despite appearing to be weeks into infection. They moved in a coordinated formation, maintaining sight lines with each other, almost like a hunting party. They paused at the center of the clearing and one tilted its head back, seeming to scent the air. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked directly toward my position, though I was certain my blind was undetectable at that distance. After several minutes, they moved on, disappearing into the eastern tree line. I remained motionless for an hour, after they departed, processing what I'd seen. The implications were staggering. The infection wasn't just creating stronger or faster variants, it was creating smarter ones that worked together. The evolutionary leap was happening faster than I could have imagined. I returned to my cabin the following morning and immediately reached out to my growing network of specialists via the radio. Others had reported similar sightings across the region. A marine biologist in the Mississippi Delta described infected that had adapted to swimming efficiently in ocean currents. A former park ranger in the Appalachians had documented pack behavior among infected in his territory. We were all seeing the same pattern: rapid adaptation to specific environments. This exchange of information became my lifeline in the coming days. While I had survived the initial outbreak through isolation, I began to understand that long-term survival would require coordination, pooling knowledge, and resources. We established regular communication schedules, shared observation techniques, and mapped the evolving threat landscape across the southeastern states. One morning in early November, about 5 weeks after the initial outbreak, my radio crackled with an emergency transmission outside our scheduled contact time. It was Dr. Eliza Chen, a wildlife pathologist who had survived by barricading herself in a research station near the Florida state line. She was reporting a significant infected migration, thousands strong, moving northwest through her territory. The description matched the herd patterns I'd observed, but on a much larger scale. When I cross-referenced her observations with reports from other stations, a troubling picture emerged. Multiple large herds were converging, all moving toward central Louisiana, toward the military installation I'd discovered. Whether drawn by deliberate attraction methods or some other force, the concentration of infected in one region would dramatically shift the survival dynamics for everyone in their path. I shared my knowledge of the military presence, something I had been reluctant to broadcast previously. The response was immediate. Several others had observed similar installations in their territories, all heavily fortified, all apparently self-sufficient, all seemingly interested in the infected rather than civilian rescue. The pattern suggested a coordinated operation that had been planned well in advance of the public outbreak. This revelation split our network. Some believed we should attempt contact with these installations, seeking protection or cooperation. Others, including myself, advocated caution. Whoever these military units were, they had resources to help civilian survivors but had chosen not to. Their priorities were clearly elsewhere, and I wasn't convinced they would welcome our attention. The debate became moot the following day when 3 of our network stations went silent simultaneously. All had been located near known military installations. The implications were clear. Our communications were being monitored and the military was neutralizing potential observers. Whether they considered us threats or simply complications to their operation didn't matter. The result was the same. We immediately changed frequencies and adopted a more secure communication protocol, using wildlife management code phrases that would sound like technical jargon to any casual listener. Our network contracted to only the most trusted members, those who had been consistent since the beginning. Even with these precautions, we kept truly sensitive information out of the broadcasts. 2 days after we implemented these measures, I received a visitor. I was conducting routine perimeter maintenance when my alarm system signaled movement on the western approach. I took up a concealed position and waited, expecting infected. Instead, a single human figure emerged from the tree line. Male, military, bearing but in civilian clothes, moving with the caution of someone who knew how to navigate hostile territory. I tracked him through my rifle scope as he approached my cabin. He carried a military-grade rifle but kept it pointed down, More telling was the fact that he moved directly to my location without searching, suggesting he knew exactly where I was based. I let him reach the clearing before revealing my position, my own weapon-trained center mass. "That's far enough," I called. "State your business." He stopped immediately, keeping his hands visible. "Deacon Mercier, wildlife management specialist?" The fact that he knew my name sent ice through my veins. "Who's asking?" "Captain James Reeves, Special Operations. Detachment. I'm here to talk, not threaten. You've been watching us. We've been watching you too." I kept my rifle steady. The last people who were watching military installations disappeared from radio contact. He nodded. "Different command structure, different protocols. My team operates independently." He slowly reached into his pocket and held up a small notebook. "You've been documenting infected behavior patterns. So have we. I think we should compare notes." I kept him in my sights for a full minute, weighing options. Finally, I gestured toward the cabin porch. "Weapon on the ground first, then we can talk." What followed was the most illuminating conversation I'd had since the outbreak began. Captain Reeves represented a military scientific task force that had been monitoring the situation since before the public was aware. They had identified the initial pathogen months earlier, but had been unable to contain it once it entered the human population. Now they were studying its evolution, trying to predict its development path and identify potential weaknesses. "The standard infected are problematic but manageable," he explained as we sat across from each other, both still tense. "It's the variants we're concerned about, the ones you've been tracking in the eastern swamps." "How do you know what I've been tracking?" I asked. "We have drones. Limited resource, but we use them to monitor key areas. Your observation techniques drew our attention. Most survivors are focused on day-to-day existence. You're taking a scientific approach. That's valuable." He confirmed what I had already suspected about the advanced infected. The virus was evolving rapidly, producing specialized variants adapted to different environments. More concerning, it appeared to be developing centralized control mechanisms, with the more advanced variants directing the behavior of the standard infected. "It's exhibiting swarm intelligence," he said, "like ants or bees. Individual infected have limited capabilities, but collectively they're becoming more dangerous, more strategic. The hunters you've observed are actually coordinator variants. They direct the standard infected, use them as cannon fodder or detection systems." "What about the military installations?" I asked. "What are they doing if not evacuating survivors?" His expression darkened. "Most are standard containment and research operations. Some are testing potential treatments or weapons against the infected. But there are other installations with different priorities. Political continuity, resource security. Some had advance, warning and preparation that others didn't." I processed this information carefully. "And your team? What's your priority?" "Survival of the species," he said simply. "Not just individual humans. Humanity as a viable population. That means understanding what we're up against, finding weaknesses, developing counter-strategies. And it means identifying people with the skills and knowledge to rebuild when this is contained." I wasn't sure I believed everything he told me, but enough rang true to be compelling. He was right about the coordinator variants, right about the swarm behavior, and right that my observation methods had value beyond my personal survival. "We've been establishing a network of observation stations," he continued. "Specialists like you who understand ecological systems and can document the infection's integration into the environment. We provide security and resources. You provide expertise and data collection. Interested?" I thought about my dwindling supplies, about the increasingly complex threat landscape, about the network of specialists I'd connected with, some of whom had already gone silent. "I work alone," I said. "It's kept me alive this long." He nodded. "We're not asking you to relocate. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. We'll establish secure supply drops and communication protocols. All we ask is that you share your observations and consider our tactical suggestions when they're offered. And if I refuse, then we leave. No threat, no consequences. You go back to solo survival. But I think you understand that the situation is evolving beyond what individuals can manage alone. Networks are forming, not just among the infected. I considered the offer overnight after he departed to camp nearby. The partnership offered resources and security I couldn't guarantee alone, but it also meant compromising my independence, trusting people I had no reason to trust except shared interests. By morning, I had reached my decision. Pragmatism won over isolation. I agreed to their terms with specific conditions about my autonomy and territory. The arrangement proved immediately beneficial. The first supply drop arrived 3 days later, containing ammunition, medical supplies, and surveillance equipment beyond what I could have scavenged. More valuable was the information exchange. My observations were collected alongside those from dozens of other specialists across the country, creating a comprehensive picture of the outbreak's progression that no individual could have assembled. For 2 weeks, the system worked as promised. I maintained my observation routines, documenting infected behavior patterns and environmental interactions. Regular supply drops sustained my operations. Secure communications kept me connected to both Captain Reeves's team and my original specialist network, which I had cautiously informed about the arrangement. Then everything changed. I was conducting routine surveillance of the Eastern Territory when a massive explosion shook the ground. Looking north, I saw smoke rising from the direction of the military installation. Through my field glasses, I could make out fires burning across the compound. The perimeter appeared breached in multiple locations, with gunfire visible even at my distance. I immediately attempted radio contact with Reeves's team but received no response. All frequencies were filled with chaotic emergency transmissions. From what I could piece together, multiple military installations across the region had been attacked simultaneously, not by infected, but by organized human forces. Someone was targeting the very operations that had been studying the outbreak. The implications were staggering. Either rival military factions were competing for resources and information, or some group believed the military itself was responsible for the outbreak and was exacting revenge. Either way, the power dynamics of the region had just shifted dramatically. I maintained observation of the installation through the night, watching as the fire spread and gunfire gradually diminished. By morning, the compound was overrun, with infected drawn by the noise and chaos. Whether any personnel survived was impossible to determine from my position. What was clear was that my supply line and information network had just collapsed. With the military installation compromised, I faced a critical decision point. My cabin location was known to Reeves's team, which meant it could be known to whoever had attacked them. I needed to relocate quickly, but also needed to salvage what intelligence I could from the situation. I spent that day gathering essential supplies and preparing for another move. This time, I would head west rather than north, toward a region where one of my specialist contacts had established a secure compound. Thomas Garcia, a former Fish and Wildlife officer like myself, had converted an old fire watchtower into a defensible position overlooking the western basin. He had invited me to join him weeks earlier, an offer I had declined in favor of solitary operation. Now, circumstances forced reconsideration. As I prepared to depart the following morning, I heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. Not the military choppers I had grown accustomed to, but smaller civilian models. I took up a concealed observation position as 3 helicopters passed overhead, heading directly for the compromised installation. They circled the smoking ruins briefly before landing just outside the perimeter. Through my scope, I observed armed personnel in unmarked black tactical gear deploying from the helicopters. They moved with military precision into the installation, clearing sectors methodically. This wasn't a rescue operation. It looked like a salvage mission, recovering specific items or information from the ruins. I documented everything, capturing details of their equipment, tactics, and the specific buildings they targeted. Within an hour, they had retrieved what they came for and were airborne again, heading southwest. I marked their departure vector on my map, noting it led toward the Gulf Coast rather than inland. As they disappeared from view, I finished loading my boat with essential supplies. Whatever power struggle was occurring between these factions didn't concern me directly, but the breakdown of the observation network did. Without the coordinated information sharing we had established, Each survivor outpost would be operating, with limited regional knowledge. The broader patterns of infected migration and evolution would become harder to track and predict. I made one final broadcast to my specialist network before departing, sharing what I had witnessed and my planned route west. Only 2 stations acknowledged receipt. The others remained ominously silent. Whether compromised, relocated, or simply more cautious about transmissions, I couldn't know. What was clear was that the human element of this crisis had just become significantly more complex. As I pushed my boat away from the dock, I took one last look at the cabin that had been my sanctuary for the past weeks. Smoke still rose from the distant installation. In the eastern swamps, the advanced infected continued their mysterious activities. And somewhere to the south, unknown forces pursued their own agenda amid the chaos. The wildlife specialist in me recognized the pattern. After a major disruption to an ecosystem, numerous species compete to establish new niches. Some thrive in the changed environment. Others fail to adapt and disappear. The outbreak had created the disruption. Now the competition phase was beginning in earnest. And it wasn't just between the living and the dead anymore. My journey west toward Thomas Garcia's watchtower would take 3 days through increasingly unfamiliar territory. I had mapped most of the region before the outbreak, but had rarely ventured into the western basin due to jurisdictional boundaries. Now, with no jurisdictions left to respect, I was entering areas I knew primarily from topographical maps and colleagues' reports. I traveled exclusively during daylight hours, moving slowly and cautiously through the secondary waterways rather than the main channels. The boat was heavily loaded with supplies, sitting low in the water and requiring careful navigation through the shallow cypress groves. Each night, I established temporary camps in elevated positions, setting multiple perimeter alarms and sleeping in short shifts to maintain vigilance. The first day passed without significant incident. I encountered small groups of standard infected but was able to avoid detection through careful timing and movement. The waterways were notably emptier of human traffic than they had been even a week prior. Whether this indicated higher infected concentration, driving survivors away, or simply the continued decline of the human population, I couldn't determine. On the second day, I crossed into what had once been Thibodeau Bassin, an area I had occasionally surveyed for invasive species before the outbreak. The landscape had changed dramatically. Large sections of the cypress forest had been burned, creating open channels through previously dense growth. Whether from natural lightning strikes or human intervention wasn't immediately clear, but the impact was significant. Wildlife patterns were disrupted, with unusual concentrations of birds and small mammals in the untouched areas. Midway through the basin, I encountered the first evidence of the large herd I had observed forming days earlier. A wide trail of trampled vegetation and disturbed mud extended through the swamp, as if a slow-moving flood had passed through recently. The path was at least 50 yards wide in places, suggesting hundreds or even thousands of infected moving together. Most concerning was its direction. The herd was moving northwest, directly toward Thomas Garcia's watchtower. I attempted radio contact immediately but received no response. This wasn't necessarily alarming. We had established scheduled communication windows to minimize transmission time and reduce the chance of detection. The next window wasn't until evening. I faced a critical decision: continue my careful pace, or accelerate toward the watchtower to provide warning, potentially exposing myself to greater risk. The wildlife management specialist in me recognized the pattern unfolding. When predator concentration reaches critical levels in a territory, prey species must either adapt rapidly or evacuate. Thomas had established his position based on the same defensive principles I had used: elevation, limited access points, clear visibility. But no position was truly secure against the numbers I was seeing evidence of. I chose to increase my pace while maintaining stealth as much as possible. The herd's trail was at least a day old, judging by the condition of the disturbed vegetation. They had a significant head start, but their movement would be slower than my boat, even fully loaded. I might still arrive in time to provide warning. By late afternoon, I reached a point where a raised road crossed the basin, creating a natural, barrier across the wetlands. The road itself was partially submerged in places but still provided elevated dry ground. I decided to make camp early, securing my boat and climbing to the roadway to gain better visibility of the surrounding area. What I saw from that vantage point confirmed my worst fears. To the northwest, a massive dark mass moved slowly through the distant tree line. The herd had grown since I last observed it, now stretching nearly half a mile in length. And it was, indeed, headed directly toward the fire watchtower that was my destination. I set up my observation equipment and began documenting details of the herd's movement patterns. Unlike the somewhat random shambling of individual infected, the herd moved with disturbing purpose. At its edges, I could make out the now familiar figures of the coordinator variants, the more advanced infected that seemed to direct the others. They maintained the perimeter, occasionally corralling standard infected that strayed from the main group. Most concerning was the new behavior I observed at the front of the herd. Several coordinator variants moved ahead of the main mass, appearing to scout the terrain. They would advance, pause to assess an area, then either continue or redirect the herd's path slightly to avoid obstacles. The level of tactical awareness was far beyond what I had documented previously. As dusk approached, I attempted radio contact with Thomas's watchtower again. This time I received a response, though the signal was weak and broken. "Deacon? That you?" Thomas's voice crackled through the static. "Where are you?" "About 15 miles southeast of your position," I replied. "Thomas, there's a massive herd moving directly toward you. Largest concentration I've seen yet. You need to evacuate immediately." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I thought we'd lost connection. Finally, his voice returned, tighter than before. "Can't evacuate. We've got 23 people here now. Children, elderly. Our vehicles were sabotaged 3 days ago. Someone doesn't want us moving." This was new information. When we'd last communicated, Thomas had mentioned only a small group of 5 specialists operating from the watchtower. "What happened?" I asked. "Refugee group arrived a week ago. Forest Service team. They were being pursued by something they couldn't identify. Not standard infected. We took them in." Another pause. "Deacon, how many in this herd?" I hesitated before answering. False hope wouldn't help their situation. "From what I can see, at least 1,000, possibly more. And they're being directed by coordinator variants." The silence that followed told me he understood the implications. The watchtower was designed as an observation post, not a fortress. It could repel small groups of infected or human threats, but nothing on the scale approaching them. "How long do we have?" he finally asked. I calculated based on the herd's current movement rate and distance. At their current pace, they'll reach you by midday tomorrow. Sooner if something accelerates them. "We've been hearing unusual sounds to the south. Mechanical noises. Thought it might be military activity. Could that be driving them?" The pieces connected in my mind. The attack on the military installation, the helicopters I'd observed, the unusual movement patterns of the herd. Something or someone was deliberately driving the infected toward the watchtower. The question was why. "Thomas, listen carefully," I said. "I think the herd is being manipulated, driven deliberately in your direction. The military installation to the east was attacked recently. There may be a connection." "Deliberately?" His voice sharpened. "Who would do that? Why?" "I don't know yet, but I'm coming to you. Hold position and prepare whatever defenses you can. I'll be there by dawn." I broke camp immediately, calculating that the risk of night travel was now outweighed by the urgency of the situation. The raised road provided a guide I could follow even in limited visibility, and the quarter moon gave just enough light to navigate by. I pushed hard through the night, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest or check my bearings. The darker landscape revealed new information about the herd's movement. In several places I spotted strange flashing lights at the rear of the infected mass, visible only because of the darkness. They pulsed in specific patterns, always followed by shifts in the herd's direction or pace. Someone or something was indeed directing them, using light signals that the coordinator variants responded to. I arrived at the base of the watchtower as dawn broke, exhausted but alert from the adrenaline coursing through my system. The structure rose nearly 100 feet above the surrounding forest, originally designed to spot wildfires across the basin. Thomas had modified it extensively, adding reinforced barriers at the base and multiple defensive positions throughout its height. Thomas met me at the ground-level entry point, looking haggard but determined. The former Fish and Wildlife officer had lost weight since I'd last seen him months before, but his eyes retained their sharp focus. He quickly led me up the series of ladders to the main platform, where the rest of his group had gathered. The sight was sobering. 23 people crowded the platform designed for perhaps 6 observers. The Forest Service team made up the majority, still wearing their uniform shirts, though little else matched standard issue anymore. Among them were 4 children and 2 elderly individuals, all looking exhausted and frightened. They had basic weapons, service pistols, a few hunting rifles, but nothing that would repel the approaching herd. "We've been monitoring their approach since your warning," Thomas said, leading me to the eastern observation window. Through binoculars, the herd was clearly visible now, less than 5 miles away and moving steadily toward us. From this elevated position, I could finally see its true scale. The mass stretched nearly a mile in length, containing far more infected than I had initially estimated. "There must be 2,000 or 3,000, I said quietly, so only Thomas could hear. "More than I've ever seen gathered in one place." He nodded grimly. "We've been trying to understand why they're so focused on this location. There's nothing here that should attract them specifically." I shared my observations about the light signals I'd seen during the night. "I think they're being herded like cattle, directed specifically toward this tower." "But why?" Thomas asked. "We're not a threat to anyone, just survivors trying to hold on." The answer came to me as I scanned the western horizon. Nearly invisible, against the morning sun, a thin column of smoke rose from a point perhaps 10 miles beyond the tower. "What's in that direction?" I asked, pointing. Thomas squinted, then his expression changed. "The National Guard Armory. We've avoided it since the outbreak. Too exposed, too likely to be targeted by scavengers. But it should still have weapons, vehicles, supplies." The pieces fell into place. Whoever had attacked the military installation I'd been near was now using the infected as a weapon, driving them toward the watchtower to flush out or eliminate our group, clearing the path to the armory beyond. It was ruthlessly efficient. They didn't have to expose themselves to any risk, just manipulate the infected and let them do the work. "We need to break their pattern," I said. "Disrupt whatever control mechanism they're using on the herd." "How?" "We can't fight those numbers." I thought back to my wildlife management training. When dealing with invasive species or predator control, direct confrontation was rarely effective. Instead, we relied on understanding behavior patterns and exploiting natural responses. "Fire," I said finally. "It's what they fear most instinctively. We used controlled burns to direct animal movements all the time in conservation work." Thomas shook his head. "The basin's too wet right now for an effective burn. Recent rains have saturated everything." "Not everything," I replied, looking at the tower itself. "This structure is primarily wood, old, dry wood." His eyes widened as he understood what I was suggesting. "You want to burn the tower? With us in it?" "No, with them around it. We create a controlled evacuation route first, then use the tower as bait. Set charges to ignite it when the herd is concentrated around the base." The plan took shape quickly as we assessed our resources. The Forest Service team had experience with controlled burns and carried some equipment for that purpose. We had limited fuel but enough to create a directional burn pattern. Most crucially, we had the element of surprise. Whoever was manipulating the herd wouldn't expect a preemptive action from what they likely perceived as desperate, trapped survivors. We worked frantically through the morning, preparing defensive positions along a narrow evacuation corridor to the southwest, away from both the approaching herd and the likely position of those controlling them. We assembled makeshift incendiary devices throughout the lower levels of the tower. designed to ignite in sequence rather than simultaneously, creating a sustained burn that would hold the infected's attention. The children and elderly were positioned at the center of our evacuation group, surrounded by those best able to fight if necessary. Each person carried only what they absolutely needed for survival. Everything else was left behind to burn with the tower. By midday, the herd had reached the clearing surrounding the watchtower. From our elevated position, the sight was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The mass of infected bodies flowed like a living river around the base of the structure, probing for entry points but not yet attempting to climb or break through the reinforced barriers. At the rear edge of the herd, just visible through binoculars, I spotted what we were looking for. 3 vehicles positioned on a distant rise, with equipment mounted on their roofs. Light emitters, most likely, used to direct the coordinator. Variants. Now we knew our enemy's position, though not their identity. "They're waiting for the herd to break in naturally," Thomas observed, "preserving the structure and anything inside for their own use afterward." "Then we've got one advantage," I replied. "They don't want to damage the tower or its contents. Hey there, they won't expect us to do it ourselves." We initiated our plan as the infected concentration reached its peak around the tower base. The southwest corridor was cleared by a small advance team, creating noise distractions to draw infected away from our planned route. Once a path was confirmed, the main group began their careful descent via the emergency ladders on the tower's blind side. I remained at the control platform with Thomas and 2 Forest Service officers, who had volunteered to help trigger the incendiary sequence. We watched tensely as the evacuation proceeded below, ready to accelerate our timeline if the herd's behavior changed suddenly. The first group reached the ground safely and moved into the prepared corridor, proceeding southwest as planned. The second group followed, maintaining the tight formation we had practiced. Everything was proceeding according to plan when a sudden shift occurred in the herd's behavior. The infected at the perimeter began moving with new purpose, circling around to the southwest side where our evacuation was underway. Someone had spotted our attempt and was redirecting the herd to intercept. We were out of time. "Light it now," I told Thomas. "We'll have to move faster than planned." He hesitated only briefly before triggering the first incendiary charges at the tower's base. Flames erupted along the eastern side, immediately drawing the attention of nearby infected. As they turned toward the new stimulus, the pressure on our evacuation route temporarily decreased. We rapidly descended to join the final evacuation group, the heat from the growing fire already intensifying around us. The tower's dry wood caught quickly, creating exactly the distraction we had hoped for. The infected swarmed toward the flames, their primitive instincts drawing them to the movement and light despite the danger it represented. As we reached the ground level, I looked back at the scene unfolding. The tower was now fully engulfed, in flames creating a beacon visible for miles. The infected had completely surrounded it, transfixed by the fire. Their controllers' signals, whatever they were, had been overridden by this more primal attraction. We joined the final evacuation group and moved swiftly through the southwest corridor, encountering only scattered infected that were easily dispatched. Within an hour, we had reached the rendezvous point Thomas had established 3 miles from the tower, a dried creek bed that provided natural cover. From that vantage point, we could still see the tower burning in the distance, a pillar of smoke, rising high into the sky. The herd remained concentrated around it, their original programming disrupted by the more immediate stimulus. But we had little time to admire our handiwork. Whoever had been controlling them would soon realize what had happened and potentially pursue us directly. Thomas assembled the group quickly. "We move west immediately. There's a ranger station, another 5 miles ahead with vehicles that might still be operational. Our priority is distance from both the herd and whoever was controlling them." As the group prepared to move out, I took one last look eastward, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Through my binoculars, I spotted movement on the distant rise where the controller vehicles had been positioned. They were indeed relocating, though whether to pursue us or salvage their operation remained to be seen. "They're mobile," I told Thomas. "We should assume they'll track us." He nodded grimly. All the more reason to reach those vehicles. On foot we're too vulnerable, especially with children and elderly. As we moved out, I considered the implications of what we'd witnessed. The strategic use of infected as weapons represented a disturbing evolution in human conflict during this crisis. Someone had developed the technology to manipulate the herd behavior, effectively weaponizing the outbreak itself. And they were well-equipped, organized, and ruthless in their methods. The ranger station appeared through the trees as dusk approached. A small compound surrounded by a chain-link fence, it had clearly been abandoned early in the outbreak. The gate stood open, and tall grass had grown throughout the yard. Most promising were the 3 Forest Service trucks parked in the side lot, appearing relatively untouched. Thomas sent scouts ahead to secure the perimeter while the main group rested at the tree line. I joined the scouting team, approaching the station with weapons ready, alert for any sign of infected or human presence. The buildings were empty, showing signs of hasty evacuation, but no struggle or violence. In the garage, we found tools, supplies, and most critically fuel stores that had been properly secured before abandonment. 2 of the 3 vehicles had operational batteries and started with minimal effort. The third would serve as a parts resource if needed. We quickly organized a loading plan, prioritizing fuel, medical supplies, and essential equipment. Within an hour, we were prepared to move again, the group distributed between the 2 functioning trucks. As I helped the last evacuees board, Thomas approached with a map spread across the hood of one vehicle. "We need to make a decision," he said. "West takes us deeper into uninhabited areas, potentially safer from infected but farther from resources and other survivor groups. North would eventually reach the interstate corridor. More dangerous, but more likely to connect with organized resistance or government remnants." I considered what I knew about the regional situation. The military presence I'd observed suggested some organized structure remained, but their priorities were unclear and potentially hostile to independent survivor groups. The infected concentration was highest along the former population centers that followed the interstate system. "West," I said finally. "At least temporarily. We need to get clear of whoever was controlling that herd. Once we're certain we're not being pursued, we can reassess." Thomas nodded in agreement. "West it is. There's an old forestry research station about 80 miles from here. Remote, defensible, designed for long-term occupation. If it hasn't been overrun, it could serve as a reasonable sanctuary while we develop a more permanent solution." As we prepared to depart, I took one final scan of our surroundings. In the far distance, the watchtower continued to burn, a beacon in the growing darkness. The herd remained concentrated around it, though their patterns would shift once the fire began to die. And somewhere in between, unknown forces pursued their own agenda amid the chaos of this transformed world. We pulled away from the ranger station as night fell fully, headlights off to avoid detection, navigating by moonlight and the driver's knowledge of the service roads. Our immediate crisis had been averted, but the larger situation remained precarious. We had survived the herd, but the human element had proven more calculating and dangerous than I had anticipated. As we drove west into uncertainty, I reflected on how rapidly the dynamics of survival had evolved in just these few weeks since the outbreak began. It was no longer simply about avoiding the infected or securing resources. Strategic thinking, alliance building, and understanding the motivations of other survivor groups had become equally critical. The rules of this new ecosystem were still being written, and those who failed to adapt would not survive to see what emerged. From the chaos, our journey to the forestry research station was slower than anticipated. The service roads had deteriorated significantly since the outbreak, with flooding and fallen trees forcing frequent detours. We traveled exclusively at night, maintaining blackout conditions and posting guards during daylight hours when we hunkered down in concealed positions. The 2 vehicles stayed in close proximity, communicating via short-range radios that minimized the risk of detection by any monitoring systems. The transformation of the landscape became increasingly apparent as we moved west. Without human maintenance, nature was rapidly reclaiming infrastructure. Roads were buckling as root systems expanded beneath them. Buildings we passed were already being enveloped by aggressive subtropical vegetation. In normal circumstances, this process would take decades, but the combination of an unusually wet season and the absence of human intervention had accelerated the change dramatically. On the third night of travel, we encountered another survivor group for the first time since leaving the watchtower. We detected their campfire from nearly a mile away, a rookie mistake that suggested either desperation or inexperience. Thomas halted our convoy, and we dispatched a small reconnaissance team to assess the situation before deciding whether to make contact. I joined the recon team, moving silently through the forest alongside Maria Chen, one of the Forest Service specialists, who had proven exceptionally adept at stealth movement. We approached downwind, utilizing the cover of a dry creek bed that ran near their position. From 50 yards out, we could observe their camp without risk of detection. The group consisted of 7 individuals clustered around a small fire, their vehicles parked haphazardly nearby. They had established no perimeter security that I could detect, and their conversation carried clearly through the night air. They were discussing their journey north toward what they believed was a FEMA safe zone near Shreveport, based on radio broadcasts they'd received days earlier. "Military convoys heading that direction," one man insisted. "Has to be something established there. Government doesn't just disappear." I exchanged glances with Maria. We both recognized the pattern. Similar broadcasts had lured desperate survivors toward non-existent safe zones throughout the early outbreak, sometimes into deliberate traps. Whether this was misinformation or hopeful thinking, the group was traveling based on dangerously outdated intelligence. We withdrew to report our findings to Thomas and the leadership council that had formed among our expanded group. The debate was brief but intense. Some argued for making contact, warning the other survivors about the potential trap and perhaps recruiting additional members for our community. Others advocated avoiding any interaction that might compromise our security or trajectory. Ultimately, we decided on a middle approach. We would not make direct contact but would leave supplies and an anonymous written warning about the questionable nature of the Shreveport broadcasts. The package was placed where they would certainly find it, during their morning activities, along with recent intelligence about infected concentrations along their planned route. This compromise reflected the evolving ethical framework of our post-outbreak community. Direct intervention carried risks we couldn't justify, but abandoning others to preventable danger violated the principles of mutual aid that had kept our own group alive. The balance was imperfect, but necessary in a world where resources, including goodwill, had to be carefully managed. We continued westward, reaching the outer perimeter of the Forestry Research Station on the 5th night. The facility was located atop a natural rise, providing excellent visibility in all directions. The main structure was a 3-story building of concrete and steel, designed to withstand the hurricanes and flooding common to the region. Surrounding it were several smaller outbuildings, all enclosed within a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. From our observation position half a mile out, the station appeared intact and unoccupied. No lights were visible, no movement detected around the perimeter. Most promising was the absence of the telltale signs of infected presence. No concentration of carrion birds, no disturbed vegetation patterns in the predictable movement corridors. We established a temporary camp and spent a full day conducting careful reconnaissance. Drone surveillance confirmed no significant infected presence within a 2-mile radius. The facility's solar array appeared undamaged, suggesting potential power availability. Most crucially, the access road remained relatively clear, offering quick evacuation if necessary. The approach and entry were methodically planned and executed. A small advance team secured the perimeter, while the vehicles were positioned for immediate departure if needed. The main entrance was still secured with the standard Forest Service locks, which Thomas had keys for. No signs of forced entry were evident anywhere on the structure. Inside, we found the facility in remarkably good condition. Emergency protocols had been followed during evacuation, with systems properly shut down and perishables removed. The solar power system activated with minimal adjustment, bringing basic utilities online. The communications array was intact, though we left it powered down to avoid creating an electronic signature that might attract attention. Most valuable was the research station's design. Originally built to support long-term ecological studies, It included rainwater collection systems, composting facilities, and climate-controlled seed storage. The adjacent greenhouse was overgrown but structurally sound. With proper management, the station could sustain our group indefinitely, assuming we could defend it. Defense became our immediate priority. The existing perimeter fencing provided a basic barrier, but we quickly enhanced it with an outer alarm system similar to what I'd used in the bayou. Tripwires connected to noisemakers would provide early warning of approach. We established observation posts with overlapping fields of view, ensuring no blind spots existed around the facility. Inside, we created living spaces for the various family units and functional teams that had emerged during our journey. The children were settled into what had been the facility's education center, a space designed for visiting student groups that now became their classroom and dormitory. The elderly were given ground floor accommodations for easier access and evacuation if necessary. By the end of our first week at the research station, a tentative routine had established itself. Security rotations, maintenance schedules, inventory management, and education for the children created a framework that brought needed structure to lives that had been defined by crisis response for weeks. For the first time since the outbreak began, people were thinking beyond immediate survival to longer-term sustainability. I found myself in an unexpected leadership position. My wildlife management background made me the most qualified to establish sustainable hunting and trapping systems in the surrounding forest. My experience tracking and avoiding the infected translated directly to security protocols. Most significantly, my observational approach to the outbreak provided a scientific framework that helped others process and adapt to our new reality. Thomas and I established a council structure that distributed authority across specialist domains. Maria Chen managed agricultural planning. Dr. Reynolds, a retired physician who had joined us during the Watchtower evacuation, oversaw medical resources. Former Staff Sergeant Wilson handled security training and weapons maintenance. Each domain leader reported to the full council, ensuring decisions were made with complete information. 2 weeks into our occupation of the research station, we reactivated the communications array for a brief, controlled period. We established a secure frequency rotation protocol similar to what I'd used with my specialist network before the military installation attack. Initial broadcasts received no response, suggesting our previous contacts had either relocated or ceased transmission. On the third scheduled broadcast window, we received our first response. The signal was weak but clear, originating from a location approximately 60 miles southwest of our position. The operator identified himself as Commander Erickson of the Coast Guard Auxiliary Unit, operating from a repurposed oil platform 20 miles offshore in the Gulf. His report painted a grim picture of the wider situation. Major population centers along the Gulf Coast had been completely overrun. Military containment efforts had failed catastrophically when coordination between units collapsed. His platform maintained limited communication with similar isolated outposts across the Gulf region, creating a patchwork of information that suggested organized government response had fragmented into independent operational units with varying priorities and resources. Most concerning was his confirmation of what we'd witnessed during the Watchtower incident. Multiple groups were actively weaponizing the infected, using them as tools for territory clearance or resource acquisition. Some appeared to be former military units operating without central command. Others were well-organized civilian groups that had acquired military hardware during the collapse. All represented potential threats to independent survivor communities like ours. Erickson proposed establishing regular communication windows to share intelligence and potentially coordinate resource exchanges in the future. We agreed cautiously, implementing additional security measures to prevent triangulation of our position through signal analysis. The potential benefits of wider information sharing outweighed the risks, provided we maintained strict protocols. As our intelligence network expanded in the following weeks, we began constructing a more comprehensive map of the new reality emerging across the region. Isolated communities like ours had established footholds in defensible locations throughout the Gulf states. Some had formed loose confederations for mutual aid. Others maintained strict isolation policies. All reported increasing pressure from both the infected and predatory human groups. The infected themselves continued to evolve in concerning ways. Reports from across our network confirmed what I had observed in the bayou. The coordinator variants were becoming more common and more sophisticated in their tactics. Standard infected still made up the bulk of the population, but the emergence of specialized types suggested the virus was continuing to adapt to maximize its spread and survival. One particular report captured my attention. A marine research team operating from a converted fishing vessel in the Mississippi Sound had documented infected that appeared capable of rudimentary tool use. They had observed specimens using rocks to break windows and using floating debris to cross water barriers. Whether this represented genuine problem-solving intelligence or simply more complex instinctual behavior remained unclear, but the implications were deeply troubling. Our relative security at the research station allowed me to resume my scientific documentation of infected behavior patterns. We established observation blinds at various distances from the facility, allowing for safe monitoring of any infected that entered our surveillance zone. Though concentrations remained low in our immediate area, individual specimens appeared regularly enough to provide consistent data. 3 months after establishing our base at the research station, I observed the most disturbing development yet. A group of 5 infected entered our observation zone from the east, moving with the coordinated pattern I now associated with the advanced variants. They maintained consistent spacing, communicated through subtle posture changes, and systematically investigated the area in a search pattern. Most alarmingly, they appeared to detect our tripwire system, carefully navigating around the triggers without activating them. When one standard infected accompanying them stumbled toward a wire, a coordinator physically restrained it, preventing the alarm from sounding. This level of awareness represented a significant evolutionary leap beyond anything previously documented. I reported this observation immediately to our Security Council. Sergeant Wilson immediately ordered enhanced perimeter protocols, replacing the simple mechanical alarms with more sophisticated pressure sensors buried beneath the surface, where they couldn't be visually detected. We increased observation shifts and established new rules restricting movement outside the compound to essential activities only. The following week brought another unsettling development. Our drone surveillance detected a substantial human encampment, establishing itself approximately 15 miles northeast of our position. The operation appeared highly organized, with military-grade vehicles and equipment deployed in a defensive perimeter. Thermal imaging showed at least 30 individuals occupying the camp, with regular patrol patterns suggesting professional security protocols. We maintained continuous observation of the new group, designating them Camp Alpha in our communications. Their behavior patterns indicated they were conducting systematic surveys of the region, using drones similar to ours, but with more advanced capabilities. Their search patterns were gradually expanding outward from their base camp, putting them on a trajectory that would eventually discover our facility. The Security Council debated our options intensively. Direct contact carried significant risks, as we had no way to determine their intentions or affiliations. Remaining passive meant eventual discovery on their terms rather than ours. Relocation would abandon the substantial resources and security we had established at the research station. Ultimately, we decided on a controlled revelation of our presence. We would manipulate their drone surveillance, allowing them to detect signs of human activity that suggested a much smaller group than actually occupied our facility. We would then observe their reaction to this discovery, whether they initiated peaceful contact or prepared for aggression. The plan was executed with precision. We created a falsified camp at the edge of our perimeter, with 3 team members maintaining a visible presence that their surveillance would detect. The rest of our community remained hidden within the main facility, ready to evacuate through our prepared escape route if necessary. 2 days after our decoy camp was established, we detected drone activity directly overhead. The surveillance was not subtle, suggesting they wanted us to know we had been discovered. That evening, our perimeter sensors detected a small team approaching from the direction of Camp Alpha. 4 individuals, moving with military precision, taking up observation positions around our decoy camp. Rather than wait for them to initiate contact, we implemented the next phase of our plan. Thomas approached their position openly, hands visible, projecting non-threatening body language. The exchange that followed was tense but controlled. The team identified themselves as part of a research group working on infected containment solutions, led by a Dr. Alexandra Rivera, formerly of the CDC's Emergency Response Division. They proposed a meeting between leadership teams at a neutral location to discuss potential cooperation. We agreed, setting strict parameters around the meeting format and security protocols. 3 days later, I accompanied Thomas and Sergeant Wilson to the designated meeting point, a small clearing midway between our facilities. Dr. Rivera arrived, with 2 security personnel and what appeared to be a scientific advisor. The conversation revealed both promising alignments and concerning divergences. Dr. Rivera's group was indeed working on containment strategies, specifically focusing on disrupting the communication methods used by coordinator variants to direct standard infected. Their research suggested the coordinators used a combination of pheromone markers and subsonic vocalizations to maintain herd cohesion, systems that could potentially be jammed or disrupted with the right technology. What troubled me was their approach to acquiring test subjects. They actively captured infected specimens for study, using techniques that sometimes attracted larger concentrations to areas they deemed expendable. Their utilitarian calculus placed their research objectives above the security concerns of other survivors in the region, an approach that had likely contributed to some of the herd behaviors we had observed. We established a cautious working relationship, agreeing to share observational data while maintaining operational independence. Their scientific resources far exceeded ours, offering valuable insights into the biological mechanisms driving infected evolution. In exchange, our extensive field observations provided them with behavioral data they couldn't safely acquire through their more controlled research methods. As the weeks passed, this partnership proved both valuable and increasingly complicated. Dr. Rivera's team made significant progress in developing disruption technologies that could potentially disperse infected herds or block the coordinator variant's control mechanisms. However, their testing methods grew more aggressive, deliberately attracting larger infected concentrations to study group dynamics under various interventions. The ethical divisions within our own community deepened. Some viewed any progress toward controlling the infected as justifying the increased regional risk. Others, myself included, questioned whether short-term scientific gains warranted endangering other survivor communities who hadn't consented to becoming collateral damage in these experiments. The situation reached a breaking point when our drone surveillance detected Rivera's team establishing a major test site less than 5 miles from a survivor settlement we had been in radio contact with. They were preparing to draw a significant infected herd toward their jammers without warning the settlement of the potential danger if their technology failed. I brought this intelligence to our council immediately. The debate was brief but intense. We could not stand by while another community was placed at risk without their knowledge. Yet direct intervention against a better-equipped force carried its own dangers. We settled on a compromise approach, warning the settlement via encrypted radio while simultaneously confronting Rivera with our knowledge of her operation. Her response was coldly pragmatic. Controlled testing environments don't provide the data we need. Real-world applications involve risk. The potential benefit of a functional disruption system justifies temporary danger to small communities. This utilitarian approach to human lives crystallized the fundamental difference in our survival philosophies. Where we saw an ecosystem requiring balance and mutual support, they saw a hierarchy of valuable and expendable assets in service to their specific vision of reconstruction. We terminated our information sharing agreement immediately and increased our security protocols, anticipating potential retaliation. The settlement we had warned relocated successfully before the test proceeded, depriving Rivera's team of their unwitting test subjects. The infected herd they had been directing was dispersed using their jammers, but without human targets to validate effectiveness, their test yielded limited data. In the aftermath, we detected increased surveillance activity around our perimeter. Rivera's drones maintained constant observation of our movements. Occasionally, small security teams would probe our outer defenses, testing response times and protocols. We responded with proportional measures, demonstrating capability without escalation, maintaining the uneasy detente that had developed. 6 months into our occupation of the research station, our network of allied communities had expanded to include 7 stable settlements across the Western Gulf region. Regular communication and occasional resource exchanges strengthened these connections, creating a resilient network that shared intelligence and supported common defense needs. The infected continued their evolution, with coordinator variants developing increasingly sophisticated tactics. Yet our understanding evolved in parallel, allowing us to predict movements and establish effective countermeasures. The existential threat they represented had transformed into a manageable hazard through careful observation and adaptation. The greater threat and the greater opportunity now lay with other human groups and the competing visions they represented for whatever society would eventually emerge from this crisis. Some, like Rivera's research team, pursued technological solutions at any cost. Others focused on militant expansion and resource control. Our network emphasized sustainable coexistence and decentralized resilience. Which approach would ultimately shape the post-outbreak world remained uncertain. What was clear was that the initial chaos had given way to a new phase of this disaster, one defined not by simple survival, but by the conscious choices of those who had survived about what kind of world they wished to rebuild. I continue my observations and documentation, believing that understanding the complex ecosystem now emerging, comprising infected survivors and the natural world reclaiming its spaces, remains essential to navigating this transformed reality. The wildlife specialist in me recognizes that we are witnessing not just a human tragedy, but an unprecedented evolutionary event, reshaping the relationship between humanity and our environment in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. The patterns suggest we have reached an inflection point. The initial die-off has stabilized. Survivor communities have established sustainable footholds. The infected have reached an evolutionary plateau where specialized variants maintain a balance with standard types. Nature has begun healing the disruptions of human industry. What emerges next will depend largely on which human vision prevails in the competition for resources, territory, and ultimately, the narrative of reconstruction. I've chosen my side in this competition. The principles of ecological balance, of understanding systems rather than dominating them, of recognizing our place within nature rather than above it. These offer the most promising path forward. Whether enough others share this vision to make it reality remains the most critical question of this new world.